what would you restore or reuse? One of the things that came out quite strongly was water, and to maybe even to further the kind of the water elements within the site. That was quite interesting. So in a way, I think he was starting to describe really a kind of a garden pavilion almost, rather than perhaps a building. And finally, how would you reinvent or transform? I don't actually think we answered that one very well. I talked about it being used and having a sort of a very wide sort of range of use, from kind of village hall type use to exposition to performance, etc., etc. So I've basically bearing in mind with the building that it would have this sort of multiple potential to be used in many different ways. Was
the other thing was views. Was that
views?
Around,
Yeah.
Around how much to be contained, how much to reveal.
Yeah. There was a slight focus, I think, in the group on seeing it as an artwork, I think, wasn't there? In a way, as a sculpture, understanding it in that way. So I'm not doing 5 minutes because we're also going to talk about the second part of our afternoon, which was more practical.
Japanese garden. This is just a brief overview of a really bad map, folks, as well. I think my kid could do much better than that. So we came to the conclusion that it was almost like a jumble of paths.
Can you explain where it is?
It's as you look west from the seminary building. It's on your right hand side, and it's pretty much noticeable in that it's different from everything else that is there. It's neatly tucked away to your right hand side. So this place has never been mapped before, as far as we know. So I've done a bit.
And what is it? It is a Japanese.
It is a Japanese garden, yes. But the place is completely overgrown. Now there was some features on this site as well. There was a shrine there, which would have held the Virgin Mary at one point. But we came to the conclusion that there was very little of this garden left. And I think maybe for the future, perhaps looking at a different name for the place, and maybe not a recreation of the original garden itself.
We were given the task of working out how we would like to document the site, and that was on an individual basis rather than a group basis, so therefore it was left to the individuals to say whether they would like to document the site through video, photography, or any other way that they thought it was fit to do so. I think, well, first of all, we split up into the groups, whether that was just one person on their own who wanted to follow their own interest, or whether that was a group of 2 or 3 who sort of shared a sort of common goal. And it proved to be quite a good one for the group because there were a variety of interests, which means we sort of covered all the bases. First of all, Geir wanted to explore the idea of the walled garden as a sort of enclosed area. Although I think quickly, once he started to sort of explore that, he realised that it wasn't all that enclosed anymore, because obviously the back wall had tumbled down and you've got the slope leading down into the stream. He wanted to use video and long static shots rather than sort of having the camera running the whole time. He wanted to set it up in various different areas for maybe a period of a few minutes, I think, and see what he got from that sort of time. And through that he got sort of background natural noises from like bird songs and things like that, to more sort of industrial like the trains in the background, things like that, and he thought that those two sort of complemented each other quite well. So you've got the idea of the sort of industrial style building being in such a rural setting. Also to sort of go along with that, within one of the cold frames at the sort of second part of the garden, he's got it here, it's insulation for a sort of telephone wire, which he found just sort of sitting inside one of the coal frames, and he thought again this was quite an interesting thing. It was a sort of commercial and rural both put together. And then Liam wanted to sort of explore the seminary building just on its own, so he spent the sort of vast majority of the hour in there. He used that as part of a project that he was already doing, and wanted to use shots of the seminary to sort of be the background to interviews he carried out with people involved with NDA and involved with St Peter's. And he also, when he came back, he also wanted to film the workshops and people discussing what they'd found from when they would been away for that hour. Alex, Sandra and Michael wanted to sort of capture the sounds in a sort of greater detail from throughout the site. They took the course from out of the walled garden and headed back towards the golf course and west, and they were working almost off a sort of there was already a sort of template that they wanted to follow from sounds that they knew they could get from the site, from particularly from a previous interview with someone who used to be involved with the site, who lived on it when Kilmahew House was there, and particularly involved with the crunching of the gravel on the large driveway, and they wanted to try and recreate that sound, which they managed to do to an extent on the sort of farm track leading up to the estate. Whilst this was going on, Amanda had the camera and was almost sort of documenting what was going on in the background visually rather than just the sounds. So whether it was a particular tree they were standing next to or anything like that, it was a sort of documentation of the people, the wildlife and the places that they were at where these sounds were coming from. And the idea I think they discovered was that from the golf course, there's this, obviously the golf course is this area that's so sort of pristine, so manicured, and obviously that contrasts greatly with what the college is and what the site is now. And again, the idea that behind this huge wall of vegetation is this sort of monstrosity lurking behind there. You can't quite see it, but you know it's there. And there's just the contrast between the sort of mayhem and anarchy and then the sort of manicured nature of the golf course. Adam and I decided to go and look at the greenhouses in the walled garden, and first of all we sort of started with the sort of mechanical effect of the levers to adjust the windows in the greenhouses, and we started to look at those. And when we moved into the greenhouse, we actually caught our eye the sort of decorative effect on the braces from the wood in the greenhouse, and how it had a sort of floral effect, and also how, well, we've actually done it here, but how this is one of the few things on the whole site that actually bore some sort of influence from the outside. So in this instance it was a company's name. So we found that a lot of the site is fairly sort of anonymous in what it uses. It's sort of anonymous concrete, and there's no sort of maker's mark on it, whereas we found that there was a maker's mark on here, and it did provide one of the few sort of instances of a sort of outside influence. If you hold that up, so that's upside down, that's what's wrong. Well, they're meant to... Right, I was never any good at jigsaws.
Let's just hold them up in some fashion.
Yeah, and that's meant to be in the middle. And
Oh, there we are, yeah.
That's sort of vaguely what I meant to look
There
like.
we go, yeah.
And
Simpson and Farmer.
Simpson and Farmer. Yeah.
Horticultural builders, Glasgow. Yeah.
And so once we moved out of the greenhouse, we spotted a sort of old abandoned wheelbarrow just across the pathway, and we went to sort of look at that. And I think that sort of brought up the idea of a sort of, I think we called it a definite day. So it takes you to a sort of more personal moment where you can imagine that perhaps at the end of the day the person just leaves the wheelbarrow down expecting to go back to it the next day, and then wondering maybe for whatever reason that it never got picked up and it was never used again. And sort of just that imagery of, and then imagining that for some reason over the space of 20, 30, 40 years nobody moved that wheelbarrow whilst it was sort of accumulating with moss and nobody thought fit to move it. So we thought that was quite an interesting sort of concept as well. And then the final group wanted to look at the sort of variation of colours across the site, and they wanted to do this through photography. So they pretty much used the whole site as their sort of playground, went round the whole thing for an hour, finding all the different colours that they could, whether that was from flowers, plants, even down to the graffiti inside the seminary, and they wanted to see the sort of the variation as well as the as the sort of the relationship between the man-made and the natural, and the crossover between those two.
The group walked the garden itself, getting to know it by its nooks and crannies, its brambles and its thickets, and there are plenty of those. And they were invited to leave little luggage tags tied up with thoughts, ideas, reflections, impressions as they went around. And so people tied up little luggage tags, those little cardboard tags, up to bits of the frames of the glass houses, to bits of undergrowth, to tree branches and twigs, to the archway. And then at the end of the session, those were collected up as a nice little archive of activities that gave us a sense of people's first impressions of the walled garden. The second thing that we did was that we had come pre-prepared with lots of garden tools and some chitted potatoes, which we planted in a newly prepared and dug bed. We've used half of that newly dug area because the other half is going to be used by the local landscape group, and so there will be a fiercely competitive growing competition. Once that group have got their tatties planted, we're going to see who's grow best. I suspect it's going to be the local landscape group, because we're probably going to have to call upon their horticultural green fingers to look after our crop in our absence. The hope is that we'll get a crop to harvest by, well, God so reckons June for some of the early tatties, and for some of the later ones September, with the ambition then that our second Invisible College event in June will have some baked tatties on the fire, and our third Invisible College event in September will... What else will we do with tatties? Chips? Pardon? Tatty and Luke soup. Okay. So the idea is that we wanted to try and think about how we can make this a generative bit of the site once again, and we've gone just a wee step towards that. The third thing that we did was that we wanted to go some way beyond repopulating the garden as we were, just for 2 hours. And that's a short space of time in which you can kind of plant some ideas, far less plant any tatties. So what we did was come up with an alternative model community other than ourselves, because of course we were model examples of fine upstanding citizens, but we came up with our own model community, who are in my bag here. I can't show you them all, but there was a shepherd, there's a girl horse rider, there's Sean, there you are with your buzzsaw, there's a man with a shovel, we had cattle, dogs, we had the requisite art student or architecture student, we had, where's he gone? We even had, God, he's disappeared. Maybe he's been left up there. He has, you know. We even had somebody that looked like a university lecturer, but he's been left stranded up there. he typically is just lost up there. He's a geographer, that's right. So we created a model community with these miniature figures, and then we photographed them in the landscape, and people were invited to put those little figures together in different scenes. Now, that's what we did. I'll give you some quick reflections on what people felt about that whole process, what got bundled up in all of those activities. Some of the reflections are not necessarily right on specific to what we did, but they just kind of sprung out of those activities. The first thing was that we started then to think about the walled garden. What is this place, and what will it be, or what could it be? And there we were bearing in mind the fact that for everybody there was a really strong sense of the past in the walled garden. I mean, you could argue that for so many parts of Kilmahew and St Peter's, but the walled garden, there's a real strong sense of, you know, a labouring working history there, of people having bent their back and sweated and toiled. And in that sense, you know, I suppose for most of the people there, the walled garden seemed a really quite light and convivial and communal space. It was the kind of place where you could enjoy spending time in the company of others. And in some kind of ways, it's also a nice kind of place where you can actually reflect on the other big thing in the landscape, and that's the ruin itself. Ian Gilzine said, actually the best place to talk and think about the ruin is here in the walled garden, because you get some distance away from it, and sometimes for some folks the ruin itself can be quite oppressive. And Ian reckoned that there was actually a nice kind of psychological tension between the ruin and the walled garden, and the walled garden's a good place to come away to and have a think about things. So it seems enclosed, but at the same time a lighter, more permeable space. It's a space that captures sound in a really nice way. You hear the bird song there the whole time. So that was one of our reflections. The second one was, we had a series of questions and thoughts about what would the ecologies of the garden be? What sort of horticulture would we like to happen there? Now obviously lots of people were thinking it would be great as a growing space, it would be great as a place where we could grow some veg and people could tend that veg and tend the crop that's there. But we also had a chat about what other things might be brought back into the garden, what other type of creatures might be brought back into the garden. We spoke about the type of vegetation that might actually bring back butterflies into a walled garden. We spoke about whether it would be possible for someone to keep pigs. Also got very excited about whether animal husbandry would be possible in the walled garden. I think we'll start with the butterflies and then move on to the pigs. The third thing that people were interested in was what did it mean to play around with these little models? What happens when you literally play with scale? And they're terribly appealing little figures. Everybody can play with little figures because it takes you back to childhood, but it also allows you out of yourself. You're able to do things. Architects know this very well because they're the people that make these models with little figures on them, and they envisage entirely new communities. St. Peter's as a place is a monumental place. And it's a superstructure that everybody understands through modernism as a big architectural movement, or Catholicism as a big religious movement. What these models did was actually allow us to drop down totally in scale. And so we if you'll forgive me, we went from the monumental to the minumental. And the minumental allowed us actually to focus our attention down on the stuff really close to foot, close to hand. And that was amazing, actually. That shift in scale enabled you to build landscapes out of the tiniest things. Ian Gulzine created this extraordinary mountain landscape out of a fallen down series of bricks covered in moss and lichen, with a shepherd and his flock of sheep lost down the hillside. It's absolutely brilliant. But it's the models that actually enable you to pay close attention to the tiny details of the site. And sometimes we can lose those tiny details of the site because we're kind of caught up in the massive monumental nature of it.
What we did is we engaged in games of chance this afternoon, which is why there was lots of laughter going on, because everything went wrong, which is exactly what's meant to happen with games of chance. And I guess the point of it was that the reason we were playing games of chance in such a place is because that's exactly what the site is. It's a result of games of chance and laws of unintended consequences. So the entire afternoon descended into unintended consequences. We started out with the map of the site, and we got everyone to say what their favourite or most interesting place was on the map. Then we put the map, William Tell-like, on a tree, and we threw darts at it so that the place would be chosen by chance. The most interesting place would be chosen by chance. And what should happen in that game of unintended consequences but the place was the walled garden, so we ended up where we were anyway. and then we thought, oh, right. And Leslie Griffiths, who lives here, had sort of chosen that particular site. We said, so what really interested you about this? And she said, well, there's this really interesting cog in one of the windows that's broken in the greenhouse. And we're like, oh. But what we did is we got her to describe that particular thing, and as she did that, we'd doodle on bits of paper. So this is Callum's doodle in the middle of the paper of what we thought was going on, and it was quite a good way of actually just getting people, because they were doodling, then to start talking about it. And we very quickly went from the cog in the broken window in the greenhouse to Bernie going, well, I moved here 20 years ago. I didn't know this walled garden existed for 5 years because it was physically impossible to get into it at that time. And then we worked out the chronology of that meant, and that 5 years was only 10 years after the place had been deserted. So within 10 years, that place had become actually invisible. And then we managed to expand that to a slightly larger conversation about the landscape and nature in general. And we walked up and we carried on doodling in slightly different ways about while we were sitting in the greenhouse. So we sort of banned talking, sitting in there. And you realise it's this really weird machine for growing pineapples, and these cogs and wheels and the steam heating system that runs underneath the floor and the wires, that it's this very curious sort of Heath Robinson contraption for growing unnatural things in that landscape. And that led us on to the idea that it's an unnatural landscape. There's nothing natural about that landscape whatsoever. And we keep on talking about nature reclaiming something, but it's a nature of sort of pineapples and monkey puzzles and sequoias and sort of very strange, sort of exotic world. And one of the big debates that's been going on today in lots of different arenas is the Ponticum debate of that very variety. And then we sort of left the site behind and we went down to the next site, which Rolf took us to, which was this very weird little chance, unintended, I suppose, meeting place between the two burns. There's the Wallistown burn coming down from one direction and the Kilmahew burn coming down the other direction, so a little chance place. And we laid out all these things, and then we sort of drew the outer layer of our fortune tellers. And the idea was that each of the four things, what we said is, okay, what's going to happen? On one of them, we're going to draw, what's this place going to be like in 5 months? What's it going to be like in 5 years? What's it going to be like in 50 years? And what's it going to be like in 500 years? So it was trying to think, and it comes back to a little bit about what Tim was saying about ruins, of this issue of duration, that what we imagine the future to be is entirely dependent on how long we think the future is going to go on for and how far away it is. And the really interesting one we kept on having debates was 500 years, wasn't it? I mean, everyone kept on saying, you know, are we allowed to talk about the apocalypse? And we're like, well, yes, it's already happened. And so it was quite a good way of, in a sense, sort of yanking the discussion sort of sideways from necessarily going what should happen in 5 years' time or 50 years' time, but to what will happen. And, you know, we were sort of quite pessimistic, certainly in the long run, about the fate of humankind and the universe. I think Rolf's has got cockroaches on the end of it as his 500-year future for everything. Quite a lot of us were talking about sort of wilderness and ruination. I think the things that were really interesting about the day is it yanked us away from talking about the seminary, and we all found it really interesting to be talking about something else. And I suppose the idea that a cog in a broken window in a ruined greenhouse could sort of have ripples leading outwards to much, much larger conversations about something that we sort of thought at the end when we were sitting in the room was perhaps about natural history or the history of nature, meaning that natural history is like, history is culture, you know, changes in humankind, nature is supposedly nature, but actually the two are entirely bound up with each other, and that this sort of landscape is a sort of artificial construction of a set of processes. And we ended up having this really interesting conversation returning to sort of what did those people, when they planted those rhododendrons or the sequoia, or indeed when they planted sort of, you know, much earlier plantings or built buildings, what did they expect to happen? If you confronted the people who built the original castle with what had happened to it now, what would they think? Because that is something we need to learn to think about, because we will be one day the people who built that castle.